G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Today we are talking about how to dominate your Snake League draft. If you've got a Snake League coming up, this is the video for you. Let's go!
Jordan open. Chicago with the lead. Bryant to Shaq.
Not a game. We talking about practice.
LeBron James with no regard for human life. Anything possible.
Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Curry for three. Wow! Unbelievable. Making it rain in New York. We the North, or now we the champions.
Not the destination, it's the journey. Mamba out.
G'day again and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter at BallBoysNBA and on Instagram at BallBoysFantasyBasketball. Today we're going to continue on. Yesterday we did a how to play fantasy basketball video and podcast. So if you're new to fantasy basketball, go and check that one out. We cover all the basics. Today we're going to get a little bit more in depth about strategy when it comes to snake drafts, okay? So in this podcast, I'm going to go through some general tips and things to consider when you're in a snake draft, as well as different strategy and things that I'm thinking about when it comes to early round strategy, mid-round strategy, and late round strategy, and things that I'm going to be focusing on and trying to target in those points of the draft. Still a little bit more general, obviously not going to be talking about any particular players at this point in the draft, although we will mention a few guys for specific reasons, but very good tips and tricks for you to remember when it comes to your snake draft. We're doing this one, and we probably won't get through to an auction draft podcast, I think just because head-to-head leagues are by far the most common, the snake drafts are by far the most common draft type. So we're going to be covering this one in detail. If you are doing an auction draft, ask a question and we'll get to it as best we can. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time to cover that in detail on a podcast. But please ask questions down below in the comments and make sure you give this video a big thumbs up and are subscribed for more fantasy content coming your way. So let's get stuck into it. General strategy. The biggest and most important thing, and the first thing that I always do when I join a new league, is know your settings, okay? It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised about how many people are a bit confused about what's going on. But know your settings. Is it a roto league or is it a head-to-head league? Is it category versus points? If it's a points league, what are the points allocations? This can be changed, okay? Do you lose 1 point for a turnover or 1.5 points for a turnover? Is a rebound versus 1.2 or 1.5? Like, what are your settings? Make sure you know that when it comes to points leagues. Categories. Is it a 9-category league? Is it an 8-category league? Do you have other weird categories like double-doubles or triple-doubles or 3-point percentage instead of the standard 9-cats? Make sure you're aware of what those ones are. Some other things like you might be wanting to make sure, is it a weekly changes or a daily changes leagues? How many bench spots do you have? What's your starting roster spot size? How many injured reserve spots do you have? Do you have injured reserve or injured reserve plus? All of these things will change, just little things that you're targeting your strategy on. If you've got more injured reserve spots, you might be more inclined to take an injured guy a bit earlier. If you're in a roto league, maybe you're more inclined to take a guy like Kawhi Leonard and you can just stash him on your bench when he is out games and things like that. If you're in a head-to-head league, then you want to check when your playoffs are scheduled on. What date does your league finish on? Okay, so that can help you with your playoff scheduling. And know if you've got a player that has 2 games in your championship week, you maybe want to ding them down your board a little bit. So those things are very important to check. Okay. And make sure, again, depending on the site, if you're in Yahoo or Fantrax, what are the positions that each player is eligible for? So some sites will vary a little bit in these kind of things with different players. So all of these things are very, very important. Obviously, it should go without saying, but it is something that I wanted to make sure that we definitely touch on. Know your settings. Be very familiar with the smaller details to your settings. If your commissioner or the person who's running your league hasn't got the settings and hasn't got the rules up before you draft, make sure you bug them to get them out. I really don't like it when commissioners or people will adjust settings after the draft, halfway through the draft, into the season, because that changes things, okay? So make sure your settings are set before your draft occurs so that you can act accordingly. So if you're the commissioner, make sure that's the case. If you're not the commissioner, tell your commissioner to make sure that that is set up before you go and do your draft. The second general tip that I would say is to make sure you know your league mates, know who's drafting in your league. What teams do they support? Do you have a massive Lakers fan in your draft, and they're going to take LeBron James in the mid-first round, or whatever the case may be? I know there's a lot of Raptors fans out there, so maybe players like Scotty Barnes and OG and those kind of players might rise up boards. Make sure you're aware of that. Are you drafting against seasoned veterans and pros, or are you drafting against people who are new to fantasy basketball? That will change whether or not you have to reach for players that otherwise you might get on the next way back. If people are a bit more newer to fantasy basketball, maybe you can cross your fingers that guys that you really like come back to you on the next round. It does inform how aggressive you are in your draft strategy. And then again, are there particular players that are really popular with certain guys in your league? So is there someone in your draft that really likes fun players like a Luka Doncic or Anthony Edwards, or those breakout type of guys? And maybe those kind of guys will rise up the board. Are there people that really just love players that score a lot of points? Or has there been a player in your league that has historically punted a certain category, and he's more than likely going to be punting field goal percentage because he did it the last 2 seasons? So just be aware of who's in your league, and that can help you get as much value out of the draft as possible. The next thing in the general tips sort of thing is I wanted to talk about when is it okay to reach, and the concept of reaching. So the concept of reaching in a draft, I guess when you call a pick a reach, is what I think of it is as you're taking a player much earlier than you probably needed to. Okay, so what I don't consider a reach is if you have a player if there's a player ranked at pick 30 and you take them at pick 24 or 25, that to me is not a reach. Okay, that's a player, if you think that they're going to be the player that you want, and it's maybe a little bit earlier than others might, that's not a reach, okay, because chances are that player probably wasn't coming back to you. A reach is if you pick a guy at pick 30, but their average draft position is pick 60, then that is a reach, because there's every chance that player was still going to be available when they come back to you. You might be cutting out all the upside in that player's value. So that is where you are reaching. Okay, so that's out of the way there. So to me, it's more okay to be reaching when you're drafting on the turns of a draft. So pick 1, 2, or 3, or 10, 11, 12, because again, if you're picking at pick 1 in a standard 12-team league, you're not going to get a pick again until pick 24. So there's obviously you're not going to be reaching in the first round. And again, when you're picking at 25 at the start of the third round, to get back to you, it's not going to be till, quick maths, pick 49 or 50, right? So you've got a longer time before those guys come back to you. So it's probably more okay to reach and grab someone a bit further down the average draft position or the Yahoo rankings than it is if you're in the middle of the draft, because you're going to get a more even spread of when guys come back to you. You're not going to have to wait as long between your picks, okay? The other thing is if you are in a deeper league, so if you're in a league of 14, 16, 20 players in your league, then obviously there's going to be more picks between your picks, so it's probably better or more okay to reach in those types of drafts. And again, the concept of reaching is you want to be able to, if you think that a player can get back to you, or there's a chance that they can get back to you on your next selection, then that's probably when you leave them. Or if there's a guy that you're tossing up, you might go the guy that is typically drafted higher or ranked higher on a certain site, and just maximize your chances of a player getting back to you, rather than just grabbing all the guys that you really like when you probably could have had more players that are better value or more players that you like if you took into account where players are typically going in drafts. So that's where it's important to watch a lot of mock drafts, do your research, do your own mock drafts, have a look at the rankings, know your league mates, like we said in the last little bit, so you have a good idea of when you can afford to wait and when you do have to reach. Would be my things there. The other thing is, once you get outside the first 3 to 4 rounds, the value of players becomes a lot more condensed, right? So it's okay, it's probably more okay to reach after those early rounds than it is at the start. So at the start of the rounds, we'll touch on this a little bit more, but the difference between a player in the first round, picks like say 6 and 12, is much bigger than the picks between picks 46 and 52, right? The gap between those early players is far more significant than the gap of the later round guys. So if you have a guy that you really like and it's in the picks 80s and 90s, I say go and get your dude, right? Because that's where we're not really sure. The value is very condensed and close, and if it fits your team and it fits your build, then I think it's more okay to do it there. At the start, first 2 to 3 or 4 rounds, probably better to avoid reaching too much, avoid taking too many gambles, because that's when the value can balloon out, and you can maybe lose some spots there in that kind of a scenario. The last general tip that I wanted to talk about here was just the importance of statistical scarcity. Now, we're going to do a video and a podcast on this later in the season, and so this is more specific to category leagues than it is for points leagues. So when it comes to category leagues, you want to know what stats you can find at what point of the draft and what stats you can't find at a particular point in the draft. For example, points, free throw percentage in high volume, and assists are concentrated at the early rounds of the draft. It is extremely difficult to find someone who shoots 8 or 9 free throws a game at a high percentage after pick 40, 45, okay? That is a very hard category to make up or find big movers later in the draft. The same for points. You're not going to get someone who scores 25 points a game outside the top 60 in most cases. Or if they do, they're going to have a lot of other things that are negatives, usually as a result. So when we are understanding statistical scarcity, you may be looking for certain categories and prioritizing over other categories that you can get later in the drafts. For example, the easiest stats to find late are threes and steals, okay? Rebounds to a certain extent until you get to pick 100, and after that it is quite hard to find good rebounds. So threes and steals are the big ones. I guess turnovers if you really count that, but again, you're not looking for someone to have low turnovers. It just might be a tiebreaker. But threes and steals can be usually found outside the early rounds. You can get guys like Patty Mills, as an example, who can hit 2.5, 3 threes a game, after the draft. You can pick them up off the waiver wire. So those categories, if I'm tossing up between two guys, and one guy's going to give me lots of threes and steals, but the other guy's going to give me good free throw percentage and points, then I'm going to go with this guy here earlier in my draft, because I'm not going to be able to find what that guy gives me later in the draft. And what this also does is it helps inform us about when to punt a certain category, because it might be too late to make that difference up. And this is, again, why I find free throw percentage punting a really strong strategy, because there's very few guys, like I said, that get to the line 8 or 9 times and shoot 85 plus percentage. You're talking about your James Hardens, your Trey Youngs, your Damian Lillards, someone like a Steph Curry. You do have some guys, DeMar DeRozan, but again, he's ranked pretty high this season. DeMar DeRozan might be one. Devin Booker, again, he's a second-round guy. These are the guys that greatly influence those categories. So if I start with someone like a Luka Doncic, yes, his free throw percentage isn't terrible, and it's not necessarily unrecoverable from, but it is something that you're going to have to very heavily concentrate very early in your draft. So that's why it's something that I usually recommend. Either you have to address it straight away. You have to hope you're going to get a Devin Booker or a DeMar DeRozan or someone like that to make up that immediately. But if you don't do that, that's where I think you should just punt that category. And that's why I like the free throw percentage punt. That's why I like the points punt, because you're not going to, if you've gotten guys that are poor in those categories, it's really hard to make it up later. So just ignore it. Just move on and concentrate on getting the other categories while everyone is panicking and getting those categories. You're just going to go, okay, cool. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to get those other stuff later. Whereas, for example, if you've got a guy who's poor in steals and threes, you can usually make those up later in the draft. So again, if I've got a guy who's poor in those categories, I'm less inclined to lean into that kind of a punt. Because I know I can make that up if I need to, whereas those other categories, it's probably a stronger strategy to punt, or at least a better way to decide earlier on going into that kind of a punt strategy, in my opinion. So statistical scarcity, I'm going to go into it much more in detail in a future video or a future podcast because it is a very important topic for us to dive in a little bit deeper in and have a better understanding on how it can impact our draft strategy. So flag that one out and it'll be out maybe in a week or two where we'll dive into that a bit deeper. Let's go through the different parts of your draft. So now we're going to get into different rounds and different stages of the draft and different strategies for those stages. So starting with the early round strategy, I'm calling this rounds 1 to 4. Now, again, different league sizes and we'll vary these kind of things. But when we're thinking about this, I like to think about it in rounds because obviously, you're usually filling up a certain amount of spots on your roster. So even if you're in a 10-team versus a 16-team league, rounds 1 to 4 will not change your strategy, in my opinion, because if it's a deeper league, even if you're getting to picks 150, like you're still wanting, like that's equivalent to picks 80 to 90 in a or 70 to 90 in a standard league sort of size. So you want to treat them the same, even though the players you're getting at that point are different. Okay, so I hope that made sense. But we're going to look at them in rounds. So in the first 3 to 4 rounds of your draft, I'm calling this early draft strategy. So this is where, so the first thing I want to talk about here for early round strategy is the position to draft. Okay, so this is more for leagues where if you have the option or the choice at choosing where you want to draft from, which I actually advocate for. I think it's a good way to do it because you might have people with differing opinions, and most people are usually more content with that kind of a setup, and are usually happier when they get to decide where they draft from. So if you have the choice, my recommendation for redraft leagues is I like picks 1 or 2. Or in this season, I like picks 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, I don't like, in general, picking in the middle part of the draft this season. This is just because I've got a big clump of guys in the middle of the first round, and then in the second round, there's a bunch of riskier guys in the middle of that second round, which I don't really feel very confident in. There's a lot of injury risks and other risks and things like that I'm not super enthusiastic about. So if I can just get a guy at the end of the first round and I get the last guy in that clump of players fall towards me and that makes the decision for me, and then I get a really good player at the start of the second round, then I feel a bit better about it. I think there's a few good guys. I've got a pretty solid top 15 or 16 players. So if I can get 2 of those guys, I would really, really like that. Picks 1 and 2. Jokic is easy for me, and I do really like Giannis this year. Again, that punt free throw percentage I really enjoy. And then when you get to the end of the second round, there's usually some good guys that you can get there that fit that strategy really nicely. So if I can't get pick 1 and 2, I'm looking at the last 3 or 4 picks in my draft, if I have the option. What I would then do is, with your early rounds, this is where you're going to make a rankings list of the first 2 to 3 rounds. And this is to help you understand the best player available at those spots. I'm not a big fan of creating rankings for your league and your draft before you have a better understanding of what it is that you're doing, especially in category leagues, probably more so in category leagues than points leagues. In a points leagues, maybe you do go ahead and do your rankings for the entire draft and you don't have to think about build quite as much. But in a category league, I still would do it for the first 2 or 3 rounds so you have an understanding of what the best player available is. And then from there, you can construct your punt strategy in that kind of way, where you get your first or second round guy and you should have an idea of where your strengths and weaknesses are. So make a list of rankings for the first 2 to 3 rounds so that if a guy falls lower than you think he should be going, you can grab him and concern yourself about the stats and the categories that you're looking for later. So make sure that you're making that rankings. When you're doing these rankings, I've had questions about this in the past, per game value versus totals value. I think if it's a tiebreaker, I would prioritize the safer picks, and I guess you could say that's the total value over the per game value. But again, we mentioned this earlier in the podcast that the difference between pick 6 and pick 12 is way different than a six pick difference later in the draft. So to give you guys an example, this is talking about scaling of players' value. Last year, if we go off last year's rankings, the difference between pick 6 and pick 12 was the same difference between pick 12 and pick 34, okay? So 6 rankings difference is equivalent to 22 rankings difference when you get further. And it's even bigger the further and further you get into the draft. So whilst I say I would prioritize totals value, I would usually only do it in a tie-breaking scenario. Don't use totals value and don't overinflate a player's value based on their totals because, again, we don't know who's going to be healthy this season. No one can predict injuries or when they're going to be injured, especially in a head-to-head league. You don't know if your player's going to be injured early in the season or in the playoffs. That is completely different and changes the game completely. So whilst you might have a guy that you're a bit not sure about, you're not sure about Kawhi Leonard and his injuries, and he's a different sort of story, or if you're a bit unsure about Kyrie Irving, and you've got a guy who you think is close to him on a per game, then okay, make that guy be higher than him. But again, the difference between Kyrie Irving, who should be a mid-first round guy, and if you're picking at pick 20, well, there's a huge gap between his value and the value of the guy that you're picking at pick 20. So in my opinion, in that instance, I would be taking the guy that I know is way better in a per game value and just cross my fingers that his totals is going to be up there as well, because the scaling and the way that the value works in fantasy drafts just happens that way, that the guys at the top of the draft will make a much bigger difference than the guys later in the draft. Okay, so totals is a tiebreaker, and I'm more conscious of it earlier in my draft than I am later in my draft. But again, don't be too invested in it. Don't overinflate a player's value based on totals. Okay, use it as a tiebreaker would be my recommendation. In this part of the draft, you should be trying to figure out if you're in a category league, are you and what are you punting? Okay, so I believe that you should be trying to decide this within your first or second round picks. Okay. If you leave it too late, in my opinion, your team starts to lack an identity, and it makes it harder for you to identify the categories and the stats that you're looking for. So what that means is if you're taking a guy who's very balanced, okay, so an example for a player like that might be Jason Tatum or a Karl Anthony Towns or a Kevin Durant even. Those guys are quite balanced. They don't have really high peaks and lows in their stat set compared to someone like a Trae Young or someone like Giannis, who's got an obvious category that drags his value down. These guys are very balanced, so then I would use my second or third round picks to decide where my punt strategy is going. So this is where that rankings comes into play. So this is where the best player available comes into play. Because if you've got the best player available in your mind, let's say, for example, it's Anthony Davis is the best player available and he falls to you and you've got Jason Tatum, okay, well, grab Anthony Davis. He's the best player that you think is available. So grab him, and then, okay, how does your team now look with those two players, all right? So maybe your blocks are now looking a lot better. So even though Jason Tatum's blocks weren't very good, it's not bad enough that you have to punt that category straight away. So Anthony Davis was there, good value, grab him, and maybe on the way back, the next best player available you've got there is a Anthony Davis. Sorry, not Anthony Davis, Rudy Gobert. So, okay, grab Rudy Gobert. All right, now your blocks are really strong, but you're very lacking in free throw percentage and threes. Okay, so even though you've got Jason Tatum there, now you might want to go with a punt, threes, and free throw percentage build, okay? And Tatum's fine. Keep him there. He's got good points. He's got good rebounds. He's got good assists. The steals might come back up. He's fine to be in that kind of a build. He's still going to be a highly valuable player. But now you've got a bit more of an identity of that team, and now you can start to look at those players in that kind of a ranking, if that makes sense. For guys who are a bit more obvious, like we said, Trae Young, Giannis, usually you'll have an idea that maybe as soon as you draft those guys, you're pretty keen on punting the categories there, because there is a very obvious way to go. In a Giannis example, punting free throws is the best way to do it. I think it's just obvious. Just because it is obvious doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. It does make sense in my opinion. A player like Luka, I've heard other analysts like Josh Lloyd and Matt Smith say that you don't need to punt those categories, which is true. You don't need to, but I still think that it's the wisest thing to do. That's the thing that drags their value the lowest down. And we can't guarantee that it's going to improve. It might improve. He might get better at shooting free throws. Excellent. If it does, cool. He's going to be scoring more points. That's awesome. But it doesn't change the fact that you can then get more value elsewhere in the draft. So I think that those guys that have high peaks and low lows, they're the ones that I would usually, after my first round pick, I sort of know what I'm trying to look for. And then I can, play around with sites like Basketball Monster, play around with sites with like #basketball, turn those punting metrics on and see the values in players change. Or check out our punt guides over on ballboysnba.com, where we go through different punt strategies and what players benefit the most in those builds. And the last thing in this thing that we're going to talk about is injured and risky players and what you're going to do with those guys in the start of your draft. So what I would usually recommend, we will have a video on this later, close to the season. So I'll do a video on this close to the season because I don't want to come out with a video and talk about all these injured players and risky players and then there's someone else that gets injured the day later. So once the preseason games start going and we see some sort of things, I'm going to go through how I'm treating all of these injury-prone or risky or injured players. But in the early rounds of the draft, what I would make sure is that I don't grab too many of these guys. So the rule of thumb that I have is that I want to have a maximum of one player that I consider to be risky in the first 4 rounds. Okay, so for that reason, I believe in a mock draft that I did earlier in the preseason, if I drafted a Kevin Durant, which in my head I considered kind of risky, I had the option of drafting a Paul George or a Kawhi Leonard in the second round, but I chose someone like a Devin Booker, who I considered a bit safer at that spot, even though on a per-game basis I have him a little bit behind those other guys. So I grabbed the Devin Booker to make sure that I wasn't loaded up with risk earlier in my draft, okay? Remember, the start of the draft is you've probably got more downside than you do upside just by the nature of the fact that there's not many guys ahead of you that have been drafted, right? So it is better to be a little bit more risk adverse at the start of the draft. So if you draft someone like a Kyrie Irving in the second round and maybe a Kawhi Leonard makes it back to you and you've already got Kyrie, maybe you just let Kawhi Leonard pass, okay? Even though he might be the best available on your board, I would still try and prioritize guys that you're a bit more confident. And that might change. You might feel different about a certain player than others, okay? I'm going to leave that up to you. I'll obviously give my thoughts on who I consider to be risky. But again, you're the one drafting your team, so you have to be comfortable with it. So make that decision for yourself. But my rule of thumb is that in my first 4 rounds, I want to have a maximum of one player that I consider to be really risky, okay? So that's sort of my rule of thumb. For the early rounds, let's go on into the middle round strategy. So I'm calling these rounds 5 to 9. Okay, so we're getting close to maybe the 50 to 100, or maybe just before 50 to just outside pick 100 in a standard league. But again, if you're in a deeper league, that might change. Middle round strategy. We'll continue talking about injury management. If you've played it safe up until this point, you can then start to take a bit more of a risk on high upside guys. So, for example, in this range in a standard league, you might see guys like Porzingis, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr. go. If you've been pretty safe up to this point, they're excellent picks, in my opinion, to take a stab on. That's where it's a good time to take a risk. A player like Porzingis could be a top 20, top 15 player per game, but he's sliding because of his injury history. So if you're healthy, you can grab him. Even if you've got someone who is just a little bit of a risk, some people might consider Robert Williams. So I'm aware of Robert Williams' knees, but I don't necessarily consider him a high-risk player. He's like a moderate-risk guy. So if I have someone like that, I'm still happy to grab a Porzingis as long as it's after my first 4 picks. And if he starts to slide, and I think I can get some good value out of him, then I'm okay with drafting those guys. I still wouldn't, however, be drafting players that are coming into the season with a known lower body injury. So an example like that might be a Jaren Jackson Jr. and Alonzo Ball. So these other guys that we're talking about as risky, at the moment we consider them to be healthy, but they've got a history of injuries. So right now, Kristaps Porzingis is healthy. He's expected to be playing opening night. Jaren Jackson Jr. is injured right now. He is not expected to be playing for at least a couple of months, maybe longer. So there's a lot more risk there, in my opinion. There's a lot more room for teams to be silly and cloud their messaging and things to change and setbacks to happen. So those guys, to me, carry far more risk than the guys who are just considered risky because they've been injured in the past. Okay? So I still am not trying to target those guys in the middle rounds of my draft strategy. So if anyone else gets injured in the preseason, this is where I would probably cross off their names on the list. The exception will be players like last year, Pascal Siakam might have been in this discussion. This year, it's Chris Middleton. So guys who have like an upper body injury that doesn't seem very serious. So for Chris Middleton, it's his wrist. Last year, it was Pascal Siakam's shoulder. Upper limb injuries are usually less likely to linger for as long. Obviously, you're not weight bearing on them and running on them. Players still have a lot of time to do their conditioning, and they can come into the season feeling strong and feeling fit. So they can sort of hit the ground running usually a bit easier with those types of injuries, thumb injuries or whatever the case may be. But when it's something like a back or a knee or a foot, those are the ones, if they are injured, that I am very cautious of. Whereas shoulders, elbows, wrists, I'm happy to draft those kind of players if I'm getting them at a bit of a discount to where I think their per game value is. So those are those categories now. This is where we're going to start to talk about stat hunting. Again, probably a bit more specific for category leagues. But the first part of your draft, the first 3 to 4 rounds, you're getting your base. You're getting the guys who are going to create the foundation of your team. In this part of the draft, I'm very much chasing specific categories and specific stats. So this is where I'll put up on the screen, I'm talking build over overall value. Draft boards, rankings, projections will all be blown up at this point because everyone's going to be, especially if there's a lot of punters in your draft, everyone's draft boards and rankings are going to be very different by this point. So this is where I said before, it's okay to reach a little bit more. If there is a guy who is maybe not projected to be the highest or the highest in ADP, but he fits what you're looking for perfectly, grab him. Just grab him. I prioritize getting the guy that fits my build perfectly than getting a guy who might rank the highest in a 9-category setting. This is where your build will dictate what it is you're looking for. So and again, we'll go back to that statistical scarcity. If I need assists in my build, then I'm going to prioritize looking for that. If I'm conscious of getting enough scoring, I'm going to be prioritizing that. You're looking for guys that give you what you need. If I need to remain competitive in free throw percentage or field goal percentage, I'm looking for players that contribute positively in those categories. So build over is more important in my opinion than overall 9-category value or rankings, in my opinion. So make sure that by now you should be very familiar if you are punting, what it is you're punting. Use those calculators, use the guides and the punt ranks at ballboysnba.com so you know where a certain player is valued. Still try to get value, you don't necessarily, like if we go back to the reaching concept, if you've got a player that you think might make it back to you in a round's time, so try still to do that, but if you feel like there's a bit of a question mark and you're not 100% sure they're going to get back to you and they're the perfect kind of player, more often than not, I'm happy just to grab that guy and then just hope that something else presents itself later in the draft, especially if they are the perfect type of stat set that I'm looking for. And the last thing that I'll touch on here is making sure that I'm balancing upside with safety. So I'm not going crazy with upside picks just yet. I still want guys that I am confident in their role. I'm confident in their minute load. I don't want guys who are coming off the bench or are low minutes, even if they're per minute monsters at this point in the draft. This is much the reason why I'm a bit lower on Isaiah Jackson because of where he's going in draft. I'm just not confident enough to take a player like that. As much as I like him in this section of the draft, I'd much rather take a guy like a Jalen Smith, who I think doesn't have the upside that Isaiah Jackson has, but I'm much more confident in his role and his minutes than a player like that. So I'm balancing upside with safety. I want guys that can break out and improve and beat their ADP, but I don't want someone who's going to completely bust and completely, it's a flip of the coin whether they're a breakout or a bust, because that's where if you take too many of those swings, you can find yourself in a bit of trouble. So look for those kind of guys that provide that good balance, okay? And be aggressive. Be aggressive at getting those guys. If you like a guy, especially if you're on the turn or something like that, go and get those guys if you don't think they're going to come back to you as well. So that is our mid-round strategy. Moving on to our last bit of the podcast here, talking about late-round strategy. So again, we're looking at rounds 10 to 14. By now, okay, if it's round 10, you probably still have one more roster spot left on your starting lineup. I am okay grabbing a higher upside guy here and maybe having him as a bench player with that last pick on your starting roster spot. So this is usually where I am okay to take those swings on the upside guys. But if you did draft a risky player or a few risky players, perhaps you want to wait until your starting lineup is completely filled before you take those flyers and before you take those big upside swings. So, for example, if I've drafted a Kyrie Irving and then a Kristaps Porzingis fell to me outside the top 55, maybe I don't want to take a swing on Isaiah Jackson, at pick 105. Maybe I want to wait and just cross my fingers that he gets back to me at 120 after I've got my 10 players on my starting roster spot. And if he's gone, well then, oh well, okay, I've still got some really good upside with the players that I've already got, okay, but I don't want to take on that extra risk because it just starts to get a bit too much. If I've gone a bit safer and I've got not many players that I'm too worried about, then I'm okay taking that swing on Isaiah Jackson at pick 100 if it's your last starting roster spot, because there is a whole lot of upside there. So there's a bit of a balance there. If it's a roto league, you can look for a bit more of that upside because especially with those injured guys, you've got the ability to just put them on your bench and not have their stats count towards your overall games cat limit. So definitely in a roto league, you're definitely focusing more on upside than you are in a head-to-head league. And similar in a weekly changes league. So in a daily changes league, you're going to still be using these players. So you don't want to go absolutely crazy. You don't want to get guys that it's just a 1% chance that it works out. You still want to have a little bit of confidence. But in a weekly changes in a roto league, you're just pure upside because these guys you might not use. They might sit on your bench for a little bit longer. So those guys I'm much more confident in drafting in a roto or a weekly changes league than I am in a daily head-to-head, a daily changes head-to-head league sort of style. The next bit here, so continuing along what we're talking about, upside is king at this point in the draft. So you're looking at guys that can comfortably beat their ADP. Again, this does change based on your punt strategy. So, for example, if you're punting field goal percentage, Cole Anthony has a significantly higher upside to your team than he does on a team that might be punting assists. Okay, so it does still matter on what categories you are targeting. So keep that in mind. Players that are upsidey and very valuable to your team might not be the same on other teams. And if we go back to that weekly changes versus daily changes discussion, if you're looking for someone in a weekly changes league, I'm more comfortable taking those backup guys or those guys that are in like those position battles. So like a Isaiah Hartenstein, like an Okongwu kind of type, those players who are projected to be on the bench to start the season, but perhaps they take over that starting spot later down the line. Mark Williams in Charlotte, I'm more keen and more interested in those kind of guys because they can kind of sit on my bench for longer in that type of format than on a head-to-head daily changes format. If you think about players like last season, Jalen Green, Jalen Suggs, if you were dragging those guys along for the first couple of months, they just destroyed you in daily changes because they killed your percentages, they killed your turnovers, they weren't producing all that much in the other categories. So very hard to have those guys for very long in daily changes leagues. So I wouldn't want to be spending any more than sort of a last pick or second to last pick on those type of players in just the hopes that they don't come out and stink it up. But again, you've got a very short leash on those kind of guys that you can just drop if in the first couple of weeks they're not doing enough, then okay, you move on to the hot waiver wire pickup that you can get instead. So upside is definitely king at this point in the draft. Let's talk about handcuffing. Again, more keen on that handcuffing strategy in a roto or weekly changes league. Most commonly and most useful at point guards and centers in the NBA. Obviously in basketball, the wings, especially in today's NBA, there's a lot of switchability and versatility in a lot of lineups. So you won't actually see if a player on the wing gets injured. Usually there's not one guy that steps into a huge role versus a point guard or a center will step in and get a lot of rebounds and blocks or get a lot of assists as the primary backup point guard. So those positions are probably the most relevant when it comes to handcuffing, so I think that that's fine. I'd much rather do it in a roto league and a weekly changes leagues. In a head-to-head daily changes, I would only want to be handcuffing if the player has enough value on their own in the bench role. So an example would be someone like an Isaiah Jackson, would be someone like an Isaiah Hartenstein, who was a top 150 guy in like 18 minutes a night last season. So they're good enough to be on your team even if nothing changes. But if it does change and you've got a Mitchell Robinson and Isaiah Hartenstein just takes off, well then you're going to be insulated with that kind of an action, and you haven't had to drag this zero with you the whole time. So that's how I would treat handcuffing. I'm not a huge believer in it. I don't go out of my way to make sure those kind of things happen, especially I know it's a big thing in fantasy football, but you are using those bench spots, especially in those especially in those daily changes leagues. So I wouldn't be wasting a spot just to handcuff and no other reason. And then the injured players, this is, again, where I'd be happy to take players like Jaren Jackson Jr., take players like Lonzo Ball. Again, in the daily changes league, I'm still only really doing it if I've got an IR spot. If I'm in a league where I've got no IR spots, I don't really want to draft those guys because I need my bench to get those games played, get that advantage in my head-to-head matchups. If I've got an IR spot or I'm in a weekly changes or a daily or a roto league where I can stash them on my bench, then fine. I'm happy to take them at this point. It's a huge upside swing. And if it doesn't work out, you just drop them. You haven't invested too much draft capital in those kind of players. But this is where I'm happy to now draft the guys that are coming into the season with an injury on the lower body in particular. So that's my snake draft strategy. Let me know if you guys have any questions, any other tips that you want to go through when it comes to snake drafts, or if you have any questions about auction drafts, leave them in the comments below. Make sure you guys are subscribed to the Ball Boys YouTube channel or onto the podcast wherever you're listening to this pod. We're going to be coming up with so much content leading up to the season with mock drafts, more sleepers and busts. We're going to have some guests on, heaps of stuff coming out. Head to ballboysnba.com, subscribe for $10 for the whole season, and I will see you guys next time. Laters.